There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Welcome. Thanks for being with us tonight. My name is Chanel Hasten. I am the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance. And tonight's presentation is on the history of abalone with Ann Vileisis. So first off, I'm just going to do a little summary about the Elakha Alliance and who we are. So Elakha is based on the Chinook trading jargon meaning sea otter. And our mission is to restore a healthy population of sea otters to the Oregon coast and in the process help make Oregon's marine ecosystem more robust and resilient. So sea otters have a very long legacy here in Oregon and a strong cultural heritage connection to the Oregon coastal tribes. And you can see here, there are various different words for sea otter. And here they are. I will not try and pronounce them because I will do a horrible job. But Chinook, the top one, is what we base off our name Elakha Alliance. We are very, very lucky to have an amazing board of directors, ranging from tribal, nonprofit, and conservation leaders throughout the state, and also throughout the United States. So just want to acknowledge all of them and thank them for their participation in our mission to bring sea otters back to Oregon. So our strategic objectives, right now we are currently working on a scientific and economic feasibility study. So basically weighing the pros and cons of if sea otters should return to the Oregon coast. We are finishing our first round of edits right now. So hopefully we'll have our second draft at the end of the month, and then we will publish that for the public in August. So you can comment and read through and see what we've found. And so hopefully after that, we will reach a consensus, on restoration. And if warranted, then we will proceed with bringing some sea otters back to the Oregon coast and reintroducing them in carefully picked locations. So if you want to learn more about what we're doing or want to donate to our cause or join our RAFT newsletter, check out the Elakha or www.elakhalliance.org. And we are also on all your favorite social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. You can also view all our, most of our presentations, previous presentations on our YouTube channel. So with that, I am very delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Ann Vileisis. She is an award-winning author of 3 books that explore the human relationship with nature through history. And, Abalone. I got that book when I first started working for Elakha, actually. The Remarkable History and Uncertain Future of California's Iconic Shellfish is selected as a finalist for the Oregon Book Award. So I would suggest you go out and grab it. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ann.
Thank you so much, Chanel. I'm delighted to be here with you at the Elakha Alliance tonight. I really appreciate the approach your group is taking to ask questions and do research, to listen to communities and consider feasibility, and to help educate us all in a broad sense, because there's a lot to consider and learn as we approach strategies for restoring Oregon's marine environment. And I think that's why I'm here tonight. Why talk about the history of abalone in California as we consider the project of restoring sea otters to Oregon's coast? I think there's 2 big reasons. First, the history of sea otters and abalone in California is generally instructive for understanding the consequences of misperceiving the ecological history of our marine environment. And although there's some big differences in ecological communities and fishing concerns in California and Oregon, there's also some very important overarching commonalities and themes. So I think it's a really useful case history for those of us in Oregon to be aware of. In addition, we have some valuable and vulnerable abalone species in southern Oregon that could be part of the equation as we think about reintroducing sea otters. So it's good for people to know about those. And I think it also points to that need of thinking about whole ecosystems, even as we're drawn to the individual species that we care about. So, I want to begin by just telling you a little bit about how I started on the path of writing a book about abalone. I was down in Big Sur on the central coast of California and I found a shell. It was this shell right here, this beautiful little shell. And its iridescence was just stunning to me. I don't know if you guys have seen abalone shells, but I was just literally inspired and I had to know more about the animal that made this shell. As an environmental historian, I research and write about people's relationship with the natural world through time, and because I was particularly interested in food history, I was somewhat aware of abalone as an amazing wild food. If you don't know much about abalone, it's an animal that was a big part of California identity and culture, kind of like lobster in Maine or salmon in the Pacific Northwest. And for a time, as I'll explain, it was very abundant, but then declined sharply, with two species now on the endangered species list, and most all others considered species of concern. When I started to ask around to learn why, I found that people of a certain age who spent time on the coast had fond memories of foraging, diving for, and eating abalone. These were vital, hallowed, formative experiences that meant the world to people. But they were also nostalgic experiences that often ended with a poignant feeling of loss that abalone's past prevalence was so diminished. There was also anger and blame directed towards overfishing, sea otters, or government mismanagement. These were factors, but as I dug deeper, I realized there was a serious mismatch between these personally experienced memories and what was a longer, more ecologically grounded historical perspective. Not only did the mismatch make people feel really bad, it also revealed that how having the wrong story, in fact, just part of the story, was part of how we let our abalone become so imperiled. So I realized there was a rich history to discover, um, and and that drew me into the story further. What happened to abalone is important because it's part of our West Coast heritage, and it's also relevant to the challenges we face today of conserving all marine life into the future. So, with that, I'd like to take you tonight on a bit of an armchair tour through some of the epic history, sharing some of the stories that I learned in my book. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about Oregon abalone and open it up to some questions. So, let's begin with the basics. Abalone are marine snails. There are 7 species on the West Coast. These beautiful shell photos were taken by shell collector Buzz Owen, who started as a commercial diver back in the late 50s. Here he is with a big red abalone shell. Reds are the largest species in the world, and this shell is particularly giant. You could literally serve a salad in it. Abalones range along the whole West Coast, but were especially prevalent in California. There's a cluster of species that generally favor cooler northern waters and a cluster that favor warmer southern waters. They also have their own niches of depth, also related to water temperature. So some northern species live in the south in colder, deeper waters. Most abalone are subtidal. This is a red. The holes in the shell are respiratory pores used by the animal for breathing and also for expelling wastes and broadcasting gametes for reproduction. Abalone primarily eat kelp. They sit and wait for torn off bits and pieces to float by, which they reach out to grab with their tentacles, and so they play their role of converting solar energy in a larger food web. One species, the black abalone, is intertidal, adapted to put up with dramatic changes between the ebb and flow of tides. So starting at the very beginning, the longest phase of abalone history is before people showed up. The oldest fossils found on the West Coast are nearly 70 million years old. Through millions of years of evolution, abalone developed a big, powerful foot to grip tightly to rocks and a strong shell to clamp down around their bodies as shelter. Both food and shell help to protect them in a sea of hungry predators, but both of these attributes would later become compelling as a delicious meat and is a brilliant, beautiful material when humans showed up. Most archaeologists now think people first came to North America along the coast, following a kelp forest highway. A single shell left from an abalone dinner eaten 13,000 years ago is some of the earliest evidence for human habitation on the West Coast. For this time before the written word, we have to rely on the record of shells, and based on archaeologists' work at the Channel Islands, we know that abalone and other shellfish were important for the subsistence of growing human populations for millennia. About 6,000 years ago, beautiful shell artifacts started to become more common in the archaeological record, revealing that abalone were increasingly used for cultural purposes, tools, personal adornment, and other ceremonial uses. Abalone shells were traded far and wide and throughout native communities in California, the desert Southwest, and the Great Basin. Here are some beautiful abalone creations made by indigenous people in Northern California around 1800. And this photo from a hoopa dancer from about 100 years later shows abalone in ceremonial dance regalia. It's important to note that abalone remain very important to Native Californians today and continue to be used in ceremonial dances by tribes on California's North Coast. One highlight of my book research was going down to see a demonstration of traditional dances at the Intertribal Gathering in Eureka, where I learned that abalone is valued not only for its glimmer, but also for its spirit and song, the powerful sound that shells make when they clack together as the regalia is danced to life. The shimmering and singing of abalone in these enduring traditional dances represents a profound spiritual use of abalone shell that stretches back thousands of years up and down the coast. The relationship between people and abalone entered a new phase with the arrival of Spanish on the West Coast. First with galleons, then with missionaries and more mercantilists in the 1700s, a period of history that we're still reckoning with when indigenous people were subjected to the brutal disruption of their subsistence, culture, and lives, while newcomers with different views took over their ancestral lands. The Spanish soon put abalone to their own use when mariners realized they could pick up brilliant shells near Monterey and then sail north to trade with native peoples far up the coast in what's now British Columbia for sea otter pelts. By the turn of the 19th century, the fur trade moved south to California, decimating sea otters and unwittingly starting to unravel underwater food webs. After their top predator was killed off, abalone, that had previously been constrained to live in protected crevices where sea otters couldn't eat them, spread out into exposed areas, reproduced without check, and became super abundant throughout the nearshore marine environment. Monterey became famous for its shells, which mariners called Monterey shells and California shells, but the name that finally stuck, abalone, was derived from the indigenous word of the local Ohlone people, Aulun, which you can see here as a place name on a historic Monterey map. And so I like to think that the word abalone continues to carry this deep indigenous heritage. The scientific name for abalone, Haliotis, also came into use around this time as European scientists started to identify American animals. The genus name Haliotis means sea ear, first named by Aristotle because the abalone where he lived in the Mediterranean were the size and shape of human ears. This illustration from an early 19th century British zoological journal is the first I was able to find for a West Coast abalone species, black abalone. The most important thing, though, to note about this pivotal time is that the new superabundance of abalone was fundamentally misinterpreted. With indigenous people marginalized and banished from the coast, the earlier ecological knowledge and history was lost. Newcomers streaming into California regarded plentiful abalone as the natural state of the coast. They did not realize that what they were seeing, that the ecosystem that they saw had already been severely disrupted. For the next 150 years or so, this was the baseline that informed thinking about the abalone, the biology of abalone as naturally abundant and inherently productive animals. The next phase of human abalone history begins with the gold rush. Chinese immigrants sailed across the Pacific hoping to find gold, but some found a different treasure on rocky shores in the flourishing abundance of abalone. An abalone rush soon began near Monterey with hundreds of Chinese immigrants gathering shellfish from shallow waters. The Chinese had a long heritage of holding abalone in high esteem for beautiful inlay work and food, and so a large export market soon developed. Over the next 60 years, Chinese fishermen took abalone from shallow waters, followed by Japanese fishermen who, using the new technology of hard hat dive suits, took abalone from deeper waters. As millions of abalone were removed for this export fishery, drying racks and large piles of shells soon became common sights up and down the coast. It's important to mention that through this period, there were tremendous racial hostilities, and so in the absence of any other fishery conservation policies, local, state, and federal laws that targeted immigrant fishermen for xenophobic reasons intermittently served to restrain the fishery. Nevertheless, by the early 20th century, the massive buildup of intertidal and shallow-dwelling abalone was in many places diminished from the superabundance that people had come to know and believe is natural, and newspaper headlines warned that California's abalone were headed for extermination. This was a time when Americans were first becoming concerned about conservation, having witnessed, with the demise of bison, passenger pigeons, and sea otters, that we could eradicate species through market hunting. East Coast salmon and shad runs had already been decimated too. Given the tragic declines, there was a hope that California could do better by using scientific management. So the state's brand new Fish and Game Commission set size limits in 1901 and then directed biologist Charles Lincoln Edwards to study abalone in Southern California. Learning from Japanese divers, he became one of the first marine biologists to take the plunge in a hard hat suit, and he became very concerned to see so many abalone being taken. Edwards soon affirmed that the risk of extermination was real. He didn't think size limits were enough and recommended visionary conservation strategies, including setting aside abalone reservations. His ideas were never acted on, but the xenophobic legislature took a different tack to wholly prohibit abalone exports from California in 1913. The racially motivated policy gave slow-growing abalone a much-needed reprieve. Meanwhile, a new kind of interest in abalone had grown. With the arrival of the railroad in Los Angeles in the 1870s, affluent tourists started to come to California to appreciate the fresh air and beautiful scenery. And abalone soon became a star attraction, with visitors hunting for the beautiful shells. At the resort in Catalina Island, one popular activity was to take a glass-bottom boat tour to view undersea marine gardens. Tourists could pay their boatman a quarter to dive down and retrieve an abalone shell, which was soon becoming a quintessential California souvenir. Increasingly, too, residents and visitors who identified as sportsmen hunted abalone for recreation. As the shellfish became more scarce in rocky nearshore areas, sportsmen blamed commercial divers for taking too many, while commercial divers thought sportsmen were to blame. Invertebrate biologists drawn into the fray determined that abalone put out millions of eggs every time they spawned. Presuming that the shellfish spawned each year, the biologists theorized that it would be impossible to deplete them as long as size limits were followed, because animals would be able to spawn many times before being fished out. These findings affirmed that belief that abalone were inherently superproductive and led the state fisheries agencies to dismiss all concerns about conservation. And the idea that size limits could maintain a sustainable fishery became something of a mantra. It seemed to work for a while in that context of superabundance. But dwindling nearshore abalone meant conflicts between sportsmen and commercial divers would continue for decades. Unfortunately, no one understood yet how the biology of this animal was fundamentally connected to its ecological history and the larger environment. So in my book, I braid together different threads of abalone history, how abalone became a commodity through commercial fishing, an icon through recreation, and also how scientists learn more about abalone and kelp forest ecosystems. But I want to share a few stories too of how abalone entered other elements of California culture. In the early 20th century, the stature of abalone hunting and eating was boosted by a well-known set of poets and writers, including George Sterling, Mary Austin, and Jack London, known as the Carmel Bohemians. After the 1906 California earthquake, they left the city behind and headed to Carmel to live a simple, creative life, writing poems and books, growing their own food, and foraging for abalone became a central part of their scene. The shellfish wasn't just a source of free food, but also a part of their vigor and inspiration. Sterling and London would dive for abalone and bring them back for beachside dinners. It turns out that an important part of preparing abalone's collagenous meat is that you have to pound it for an extended period. To make the tedious job more fun, the Bohemians made up lines of rhyming verse to sing while pounding. And it would have remained a playful private game had the writers not been so famous. In particular, Jack London wrote a novel with characters who traveled to Carmel, met up with the writers, learned their ritual of pounding abalone and singing what would become known as the abalone song. And so here we are at about halftime, and I think we could probably use a fun little entertainment break. So I'm going to teach you a couple verses of this song, which captures the Bohemian spirit. So the words are in the screen, and you can sing along at home to the tune of Yankee Doodle. Oh, some folks boast of quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. We sit around and pound, but not with acrimony, because our object is a gob of sizzling abalone. So hopefully that musical interlude was fun for you. You can see the abalone song would go on to become published as sheet music as part of the World's Fair of 1939. Abalone also became famous through the promotional efforts of one of California's first celebrity chefs, Pop Ernest. A German immigrant, Pop made his way to Monterey where he was impressed by the massive export of abalone by Japanese fishermen, and he thought Americans should be eating more of the shellfish too. So he developed a recipe for abalone fillets akin to the German Wiener Schnitzel. And when the state banned all export of abalone in 1913, he was well positioned to promote it as a premium seafood for California eaters, more specifically white eaters who were still mostly unfamiliar with the shellfish, which you can see alluded to here in some of these ads at one of the restaurants where he worked in San Francisco, reminding us again of the prevalent ambience of racialized thinking at that time. Eventually, Pop built a restaurant right on the Monterey Wharf, buying his abalone directly from Japanese fishermen, thereby helping to keep the fishery going strong. So as domestic demand for abalone grew, commercial take continued to grow as well, with white fishermen joining in too. Near Morro Bay, the Pierce brothers learned the trade of hard hat diving by watching Japanese divers and started to harvest fresh beds along the Central Coast with new gas-powered boats and air compressors. Divers would routinely take 100 dozen a day. And by the start of World War II, in just a decade, a small number of divers had fished out 10 million pounds, or of about 250,000 animals. Meanwhile, in Southern California, the new sport of skin diving took off. Here are the Bottom Scratchers, the world's first dive club. Through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, abalone were eaten and enjoyed in communities up and down the coast, becoming a fundamental part of California's 20th century beach and recreational culture. You can see that annual landings from commercial fishing steadily climbed, with a big break in the middle for World War II. Then, when the fishery resumed after the war, with many returning veterans joining its ranks, the catch ramped up to a high peak of more than 5 million pounds taken in 1958. But soon thereafter, in the mid to late 60s, commercial abalone landings began to drop and then plummet without much advanced warning. So, what happened? It was a number of things hitting like big waves, one after another, piling on to finally erode that historic mass of built up broodstock, and ultimately to reduce populations of some species to alarmingly low levels. First, in central California, sea otters rebounded. It had been thought that these animals were wholly extirpated from California by this fur trade, but a small population was rediscovered near Big Sur in 1938. It slowly expanded southward, and by the late 1950s, sea otters had entered an area near San Simeon, considered to be the most productive abalone beds in the state. Look at all that kelp. As the sea otters arrived, it became clear to commercial divers that they loved to eat abalone. Here you can see the evidence they found. It turns out that sea otters hunt abalone by breaking their shells with a rock. This set off a bitter and intractable conflict between commercial abalone fishermen who wanted the state to move the sea otters elsewhere and those rooting for sea otter recovery. As the fishermen saw it, the sea otters did not follow size limits and were eating down what they considered to be the natural broodstock, their broodstock, since it supported their livelihoods. The otter supporters saw sea otters resuming their rightful place in the ecosystem. This is a key pivot point in our story because up until this time, people believed that abalone were an inexhaustible seafood and that their prevalence was natural and owed to the animal's inherent superfecundity. But the return of the sea otter pointed to a whole new understanding. In short, there never would have been an abalone fishery at all had the sea otters not been decimated. The abalone fishery had been based on a massive accumulation of stocks, a windfall. At the time, knowledge of kelp forest food webs with sea otters as keystone species influencing entire ecosystems was still just emerging based on new ecological research in Alaska, where scientists studied islands with and without otters and found far richer kelp forests where otters were present and keep kelp-eating urchins in check. I think probably most of you guys are familiar with this research. I know Jim Estes was one of your speakers in the past, and he's really one of the people who was, um, you know, came up with this stuff. But for those who aren't, the drawings on the right show the basics. On the top, the otter keeps the kelp grazing urchins in check, allowing for the rich kelp ecosystem. Whereas on the bottom, when urchins become dominant and graze down kelp, it simplifies the whole system. It was impossible to apply the science from Alaska and California, which has more complex ecosystems, more predators and such, especially in the midst of this contentious conflict. But it raised many new questions. How had abalone and sea otters coexisted in the past, and could they coexist again? Was the ecosystem adjusting back to a more natural state? It was the start of a paradigm shift where we began to see the wild animals we use as foods not only as a kind of crop to be harvested every year, but also as parts of more complex ecological communities. There was a lot more going on underwater than we knew. I want to underscore that this was a situation where the way that everyone, fishermen, fishery managers, and community members, had been perceiving marine ecosystems, their lived experience and lived memory, was literally challenged, dissolved, and had to be reconstituted. It was a case where people could see things one way and then another, not unlike iridescence. Most important, inheriting the wrong story or just part of the story had not only caused us to misperceive the biology and ecology of abalone, it set us up to be poorly positioned when additional stressors started to hit. As sea otters expanded their range southward, fishermen were compelled to abandon their prized abalone grounds. Ultimately, sea otters became a protected species, but red abalone didn't go away. They persisted in protected crevices, only there was no longer a surplus for commercial fishing in the otter's range. At that point, California's abalone fishers moved south, focusing increasing fishing pressure on smaller areas. But despite the newly emerging understanding of abalone's history, there was no significant adjustment in how the fishery was managed. By the 70s, California biologists determined that overfishing had already significantly reduced abalone broodstock in many areas of Southern California, and that the animals just couldn't keep up. They tried to ratchet back fishing pressure, but the politics proved impossible. Another thing that happened in Southern California were El Niños, a big one in 1958 and then an even larger one in 1983, causing massive storms and warm water. Until the 1980s, everyone considered the warm water and big storms to be aberrations. Scientists, fishery managers, and the general public did not yet realize that El Niños were regular oceanic fluctuations. Strong El Niños affected abalone in several ways. Warm water and storms devastate kelp that abalone eat, thereby reducing the animal's growth and also their ability to reproduce. Up until this time, it had been generally presumed that abalone could reproduce every year. But scientists who studied what happened before and after the 1983 El Nino discovered this was not the case. In fact, abalone, it turns out, can recruit sometimes only once every 10 years. But as fishing picked up again when the slow-growing animals reached their legal size, the abalone broodstock that had long sustained a heavy harvest was in some places totally mined out. This wasn't fully realized until years later. Then another problem hit. This before photo was taken on the remote Channel Islands in the early 1980s, where black abalone, the one intertidal species, still thrived. Biologists surveying marine life in the newly designated Channel Islands National Park soon found the animals normally clamped tight to rocks were hanging limp and loose and then dropping off helpless. It turned out to be an epidemic. In just a few short years, 99% of black abalone in the Channel Islands withered up and died. Then the withering syndrome made it to the mainland and spread up and down the coast too. Ultimately, pathologists would determine the epidemic was caused by a bacterium that became particularly active in warm water, and that it could affect other species too, albeit to a lesser degree. And if that weren't enough, the biologists realized that no one had seen a white abalone in a long time. When they failed to find them with regular dive surveys, State and Park Service biologists searched deeper with a small submarine. After several days surveying 77,000 square meters of reef, they found only 4. Here's a view from the sub looking at a lone white abalone. Reviewing the data and historic surveys, the biologists hypothesized that the once abundant animals had been unwittingly fished out, leaving too few animals too far apart to reproduce. It's called the Ali effect when animal populations are reduced to extremely low levels. They have trouble reproducing because the mates can't find each other. In the case of abalone, it's the animal's gametes broadcast out into seawater that can't find each other. So as biologists pieced together the dire straits of the black and white abalone in Southern California in the early 90s, these and other species were still being fished commercially. At that point, they realized California could no longer manage abalone for a fishery. It had to manage them to survive. But still, it was hard to convince policymakers and fishers that these animals were far more vulnerable than anyone had realized. The past understanding of fecundity and abundance remained potent. In my book, I tell the story of how recreational divers throughout the state came together in a high-stakes political campaign to press the state to finally close the commercial fishery and also their own sport fishery south of San Francisco in 1997. Ultimately, white abalone would become the first marine invertebrate to be listed as an endangered species in 2001, and the black abalone would be listed as well in 2009. In retrospect, you can see that it was not easy for fishery managers to foresee when animals would reach a critical tipping point from being wholly available to the fishery to becoming imperiled. And I think this underscores the importance of taking a precautionary approach to managing all the animals that we still use as wild foods, and ideally of having an agreed upon fishery management plan in place ahead of time so everyone can be on the same page when the chips are down. I want to shift gears now to tell you what's been happening to some of these abalone more recently. With the endangered white abalone, they were so few and so far apart that biologists knew there would be no way they could ever reproduce and recover. So back in the late 90s, they decided to bring in some from the wild to start a captive breeding program. In my book, I recount this effort with all its monumental challenges and amazing discoveries. The bottom line is that it's much harder to recover an endangered species than it would have been to conserve it in the first place. But after some heartbreaking setbacks, in the past couple of years, there have been some exciting milestones of success, with scientists finally figuring out how to breed large numbers of healthy juveniles. Here you can see one of these animals up close. And in the fall of 2009, captive raised white abalone were outplanted for the very first time. Putting these baby abalone out into an ocean full of predators is a big part of the challenge for recovery. And so different methods are being tested to see which will best protect these animals until they can become established in good crack and crevice habitat. This is a continuing project, and the ultimate goal is to get lots of white abalone pulse planted into the ocean where they can reproduce on their own and help rebuild a viable population. And hopefully all that's being learned in recovering these endangered abalone can be applied, if need be, to other species and other marine animals into the future. With the endangered black abalone, the intertidal species most heavily afflicted by withering syndrome, the approach has been different. It was always hoped that there might be some pockets of disease-resistant animals. And it turns out that in a very few places in the Channel Islands, black abalone have persisted and may now be starting to show signs of rebound. They've also persisted in central California where the water is very cold. Another hopeful thing is that scientists studying withering syndrome discovered something different when they were assaying tissues about 8 years ago. It turned out to be a virus, a bacteriophage that breaks down the disease bacterium. And additional research has confirmed that abalone afflicted by withering syndrome can endure the infection better with far fewer symptoms if the virus is present too. In recent years, researchers have determined that this bacteriophage virus has spread through most California waters where the withering bacterium is present. And so it may be helping to make it possible for black abalone and perhaps other species to recover. So believe it or not, a virus may well be a hero in this abalone story. Meanwhile, the pink and green abalone of Southern California never became endangered, but they became severely depleted. After about 23 years of fishery closure, they may be slowly starting to rebound in some spots. And finally, we must return to the red abalone. Northern California communities had always resisted commercial abalone fishing and also scuba diving, so a tightly managed freediving sport fishery continued to thrive for these abalone based on the historic buildup of abalone broodstock. Tens of thousands of divers and shore pickers were coming each year from all over the state and beyond to hunt for abalone in kelp-rich coves and then head back to campgrounds to pound and fry up abalone in a tradition that in some families spanned generations. But then a perfect storm of environmental stressors hit. In 2011, there was an algal bloom that killed off hundreds of abalone. In 2013, a wasting disease swept up the west coast, decimating sea stars, including these sunflower stars, now considered to be mostly extirpated. It turns out that sea stars are important predators of purple urchins, and so without them, aggressive kelp-eating urchins grew without check. Then in 2014, a marine heat wave hit called the blob from the north and El Nino from the south, making it harder for kelp, which need cold, nutrient-rich water to grow. Between ravenous urchins and persistent warm water, Northern California's kelp forests were reduced by more than 90% in just a few years, leading to starvation of thousands of red abalone and the closure of the long popular sport fishery in 2017, a closure that's recently been extended to at least 2026. The massive extent and speed of this undersea transformation has been sobering is another alarming um, another blaring alarm bell about our climate crisis. People are now looking at many different ways to address this problem. There are efforts to create urchin-free oases. Some scientists are working to bring back the sunflower sea star through a captive breeding program. In Southern California, there's been long-standing efforts to restore patches of degraded kelp forests, so there are lessons to learn from there too. But perhaps most important is that while all these efforts can help, cold, nutrient-rich ocean conditions remain an overarching driver for canopy kelps. Meanwhile, we've also come to realize that these great undersea forests are incredibly important for sequestering carbon and thereby helping to stabilize larger climate conditions too. So kelp is key, everything is connected, and there is a lot at stake. Of course, this set of problems does not stop at the California border. The urchin barrens and kelp die-offs extend into southern Oregon as well. And I just want to show you some photos that Tom Calvanese of the Port Orford Field Station, who's also coordinator of the Oregon Kelp Alliance, has shared with me to show you what's happening underwater in Oregon. These are from a survey taken last fall off Humbug Mountain. Here you can see marine algae graze down, and in some places full-on urchin barrens. Of course, this has consequences for all marine life, but let's now briefly consider our Oregon abalone. We have 3 species on our coast. Oregon's south coast is at the very northern range of red abalone. We're right in the middle of the range of flat abalone, which is a state species of conservation concern now. And pinto abalone becomes more common to our north, reaching up into BC and Alaska. It's also an imperiled species, a federal species of concern, and a state endangered species in Washington with an active recovery program in place. Abalone have never been as abundant in Oregon as in California, but with the dieback of kelp in so many areas, it's heartbreaking to tell you that our abalone are now likely at high risk too. And so you guys all know this, I think, but as citizens of the West Coast and of planet Earth, we find ourselves at another pivotal moment. Through the history I've shared, I hope you've gained a deeper appreciation for some of the profound and enduring cultural values of abalone, and for how earlier generations derived tremendous economic benefit and enjoyment from abalone. But now these animals need for us to give something back. Hopefully the perspective of history, what we've gotten wrong and right in the past, and all that we've learned can inspire us and help us in this project. We need more people to learn and care about marine environments, to fall in love with the rich beauty of these places, all their plants and animals, which is why the work of the Elakha Alliance is so timely and important. Might the restoration of sea otters be part of how we restore the crucially important kelp forest ecosystems of our coast? There's no easy answers. There's a lot to learn. And so we'll be looking forward to to Elakha Alliance's feasibility study, but we will need to come together to find ways to rebuild resilience in our marine ecosystems if we want creatures like sea otters and abalone and so many more to persist with us into the future. I'll just mention in the near term that the Oregon Kelp Alliance has established some kelp forest restoration sites where they'll be gathering baseline information about um, kelp extent, about Oregon's abalone species, and also starting to cull urchins with a scientific take permit to see if creating kelp oases in Oregon can be a feasible and workable first step in the strategy of restoring kelp. As I worked on my book, a telling detail I discovered early on really struck with me, and that is that many different cultures all around the Pacific have associated abalone with vision. And so it's my hope that sharing this story of abalone can help us all to see a better path forward for these cherished creatures and for all of the life of the sea and earth. Thank you very much. Um, I'll just mention here that my book is available if you're interested to read more about these things. That you can pick it up, order it from a local bookstore, or you can, of course, find it at your favorite online bookseller too. But I'd be happy to answer any questions if people would like to continue our conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anne. That was fantastic. I learned so much. Those photographs from the historic California sites are pretty astounding, sitting on those large mounds. Okay, we have one question so far. So I just want to readdress it and use the Q&A feature to type in any questions that you have. From Nancy. They asked, you mentioned that the Spanish traded abalone for sea otters as North Coastal tribes. Did you see any evidence of Northwest tribes trading for abalone prior to the arrival of the Spanish?
You know, I did not see any evidence. I did not find that evidence myself, but I don't doubt that it's there. The North Coast tribes had their own, had the other abalone species that was here, but those red abalone, which are so big, I think are particularly valuable for making artifacts. And they have a particular different kind of iridescence. Each species kind of has its own color. So I think that they became particularly valuable. But I did not. I think it's probably likely it could be there. Um, we have the reason that we have that record is from written accounts. Um, and uh, so there could perhaps be archaeological evidence or some other kinds. It's a really interesting question.
Super. Well, that's the only question we have so far. Is there any other fun facts you want to share about abalone?
Well, I guess I'll just add that, learning, as I think a lot of people in the Elakha Alliance community know, we did have an effort to restore abalone, or I mean, sea otters here on the Oregon's coast back in the 70s. And it was kind of related to that time period I talked about in California when there was really an incredibly contentious conflict there that I think it's important to understand for how we might think about it talking to and working with fishermen in Oregon. But I think the situation that we find ourselves in now with climate change makes it so important for us to have a larger perspective, to think about and recognize that all of these animals fit together in larger systems that we may not know much about. We don't know enough about. One of the things that was fascinating to me as I was learning about abalone is to realize that it's been a very challenging project to learn about the ecology of marine ecosystems. Every little bit of knowledge is kind of like a brick learned in a much larger edifice, and we're continuing to learn all the time. There's still so much that's unknown. So, but I think having that larger perspective is going to be key, especially the idea of figuring out how do we restore kelp because it's going to be important for abalone, for sea otters, for getting a functioning marine ecosystem that can serve us all. So anyway, I guess that's one comment. Maybe there's a few more questions that have come in.
Yes, there is. Aaron asked, can you please repeat the viruses and bacteria situation and how ultimately beneficial?
Yeah, it was kind of an amazing thing. This I described how this epidemic kind of came through and just knocked out 99% of black abalone. I mean, and the thing that's interesting is just to think, since we've all been living with this virus, an epidemic, it kind of puts it into different perspective. But so many abalone were wiped out. It was sort of happening at the same time as these other issues that I'd explained, overfishing, El Ninos, everything was hitting at once. It seemed so ominous. And people were really concerned. And then when you're starting to talk about recovery, there was this sense of, well, how can we ever bring them back? Because the water, this disease organism is present everywhere. And then lo and behold, the scientists studying the disease found this bacteriophage virus. And it turns out the bacteriophage virus eats the bacteria that cause the disease. So it kind of blew my mind to realize that there's this whole ecology of microorganisms, of creatures that we consider pathogens, but they have their whole own ecology that's going on all the time, without us even realizing it. And so I actually found it to be strangely hopeful that this bacteriophage came along and kind of knocked back that virus so that, maybe abalone can have a better chance of persisting. So I found that to be a really wild and kind of amazing idea. I should say too that abalone have a different kind of immune system than we have. It's kind of invertebrate species apparently have like a community immunity, which is that a certain percentage of the population may be immune to the species. So it's not uncommon that you have huge die-offs, but that if you can maintain that the populations that are resistant, that's sort of where the rebound can come from.
Okay. Got a lot more coming in. All right. Anne said, I grew up in the 60s and 70s near Half Moon Bay, and my parents ate abalone a lot. As a kid, I wanted nothing to do with it. Is it
There's some people who didn't like it, but most people did. And I took out some of my Half Moon Bay photos to make it a little bit shorter so I could add Oregon photos in. But yes, that Half Moon Bay is another really big abalone scene, of course.
um, Jessie said, thanks, Anne. This was fascinating. And her friend watching would like to know more about the holes on the top of the abalone shell.
Yeah, those beautiful little shell holes that are kind of in a little spiral. It's kind of the thing that makes an abalone an abalone. It makes it distinct from other marine invertebrates or shellfish or snails, are respiratory pores. And so they are little holes that the animal uses to breathe and also to excrete its waste and also to broadcast its gametes out into the seawater. So they're kind of they have a gill right under them, and so anyway, that's what they're used for. But they're certainly become part of what we think of as an abalone.
Nancy asked, could the abalone withering and the sea star wasting disease have the same bacterial infection, then have the same remedy?
I don't think they would have the same infection, and but it's an interesting parallel of to see how marine diseases are so problematic and in fact are becoming more common, unfortunately, with rising temperatures and with globalism. We don't really know where the disease came from for that abalone disease, but there's some theory that it might have come with ballast water or that it could have been imported with, through aquaculture with that imports abalone from other parts of the world. So um, it's just it's an interesting parallel, and we could be hopeful that there would be some sea stars that have the resistance. I'll mention that those sunflower sea stars, it's my understanding that most all of them in the US are decimated, and that there's some just small residual populations that remained in the northern part of the coast. And it's from those populations that there are some scientists now trying to figure out, is there any way we can start a captive breeding population to get them back? And, those sea stars are so beautiful. I remember seeing them. It's such a highlight to see them at low tide. They're so stunning. And I just didn't quite have the understanding or realize what important role they played in our ecosystem. So, I think many of us have learned that.
All right. Bob said, the misperception of abundance due to absence of sea otters seems to be prevalent for other species too, such as the red sea urchins. How can we correct this record, the perception of what a true baseline might be?
Yeah, it's really hard to correct the record. It's a really important question. But one of the things I found is fascinating is, I mean, I think taking a historic perspective is what we need. I think that, to me, this story helps to reveal that way that you can be going along thinking that what you see and perceive is the way it is or the way it's always been. But when you go back and take a longer term perspective, kind of blows your mind and you can realize, oh my gosh, that's not the way it is. And so how do we do that is a good question. In Southern California, I referred a lot to the archaeology on the Channel Islands because there they have a record of shells that goes back 13,000 years. And so we can really go back and look in middens and look for evidence of fauna that were used by indigenous people, and that can help give evidence. North up the coast, we have a different situation with different soils, and sea level rise kind of has caused many of the earliest archaeological sites to be drowned. But we have other ways of going back. I know people, the Elakha Alliance has stories from indigenous tribal members that have shared with you their cultural stories that were passed on in oral tradition. We have history, trade records, those sorts of things. But we kind of have to piece together that deeper history and share it so people can better understand.
Great. I have more of a comment than a question. That would be nice to end on if nobody else has any more questions. And we are rounding up to 7:29, so almost 7:30. Christina said, I deeply appreciate your work to tell this story. My dad was a teacher on Catalina in the 50s, and I grew up with an abalone shell as a centerpiece in my living room, and it was so precious to him. I'm so glad to have a more complete picture of the story of these amazing animals and look forward to reading your book.
Terrific. And I just saw another comment come up, which is, I was talking about that story, and Bob mentioned that Peter Hatch is going to be giving, I guess, a talk coming up uh, that will explain some of the indigenous perspective in Oregon on sea otters. Um, but anyway, I hope it's been a pleasure to be with all of you here. And again, if anybody's interested to learn more, I encourage you to read my book. And I'm sure the Elakha Alliance will continue to help us understand more about the history of sea otters and other marine species on Oregon's coast as we investigate and all learn more about the exciting possibility of restoring sea otters.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining. And yes, if you want to catch more about Peter Hatch's presentation on the cultural importance of sea otters in Oregon, that will be on June 1st, next Tuesday, with the Coos History Museum. And you can visit our website on the events tab to RSVP. So, with that, I bid you good night. Thank you so much, Anne. That was really wonderful. All
Great. Wonderful to see you all. Thanks for joining me. Good night.
right.